Sorry, so you want to introduce me? Was I next? Sorry. I'm so incensed and pissed off about those testimonies that were just shared that I wanted to come up here immediately and talk about it. So again, my name is Melanie Yazzie. I'm a PhD student in American Studies here at UNM. I'm also one of the founders of the Red Nation, the organization, we're not an organization, we're a collective, Indigenous-led collective here in Albuquerque that's been active for the last few months. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. I want to thank ABQ Justice for inviting me here to talk about police violence. On the program, I'm listed as talking about police violence against oppressed populations, poor populations, and poor populations of color. I'm just going to focus on Native violence because that's my specialty. And also, we live in Albuquerque, and as these testimonies, I think 2 or 3 of the folks who were interviewed and what was just shared, talk about Albuquerque as Indigenous space. We are on Indigenous land, the history of colonialism here. The word colonialism needs to be used more when we talk about police violence in Albuquerque, and so we need to acknowledge that. I mean, we have several pueblos that continue to live and surround and constrain the ability of the city to grow, for example. There was strong Indigenous presence. There are 291 Indigenous nations represented in the population of Albuquerque. If you didn't know that, that's massive. There are 55,000 Native people who live in Albuquerque, 35,000 of which come from my nation, the Navajo Nation. So I think that a focus on Native issues, specifically in the context of Albuquerque, is absolutely essential when we're talking about issues of police violence. I want to advance an identity, a political identity I have. I'm an enrolled member of the Navajo Nation. I don't say that very often because I don't think that the law is very helpful. I think the law is primarily violent in the way that it interacts with Native people. I mean, we're talking about the police, right, who are like the enforcers of violence primarily in the United States here at this tribunal. But the reason why I'm saying I'm an enrolled member of the Navajo Nation, and that's what who and how I represent myself today at this tribunal, is because that identity is vested in treaties. It's vested in the idea and the fact that Native people belong to nations, and these nations threaten the legitimacy of the United States, all of its institutions, and the citizens who claim patriotic duty and affiliation with the nation-state of the United States. Because the United States was founded originally and primarily along with slavery under sort of forced servitude, but at its foundational moment, the so-called discovery of the Americas was a colonial act. The expansion of capitalism into the Americas was about killing Native people. It was about stealing by force, Native land, and it continues to be a fundamental structuring element of how the United States relates with Indigenous people. And the way that that relates to treaties is that treaties are violated constantly by the government, by its institutions, and by citizens. Treaties are violated. The status of Indigenous nations as political entities that have political power and legitimacy is constantly domesticated, it's privatized, it's ignored, it's denied, and this has everything to do with the system of violence and the extreme system of violence that Native people continue to face all over the so-called United States, but definitely in a place like Albuquerque. And so when I call myself an enrolled member of the Navajo Nation, I'm invoking the treaty status of the Navajo Nation. I'm invoking the Navajo Nation as an actual Indigenous nation that has political power. 35,000 of my fellow citizens, Navajo citizens, reside in Albuquerque. 10% of Albuquerque's population is Navajo, is my understanding. And so this is a Navajo space as much as it is any other space. And that's why I'm here. So I wanted to give some statistics, some of which I think have already been given by previous speakers and then by the speaker before me with this testimony, but just to give you a sense of not just the disproportionate violence that Native people, not just in Albuquerque, but in the so-called United States experience, but the catastrophic level of violence, right? Disproportionate is not as serious as the word catastrophic or the level of crisis that Native people experience. So just to give you a sense of statistics, 78% of Native people don't live on reservations or trust lands in the United States. 78% of people. That means people living in Albuquerque, regardless of the fact that they're related to nation states, right? They live here in Albuquerque. So we have 55,000 Native people, 219 Indigenous nations represented in Albuquerque. Along with African Americans, I'm not sure where the statistic lies because I'm bad at statistics, but Native people overall are the poorest demographic of people in the so-called United States. We experience twice the rate of violence, and when I talk about violence, I'm talking about police violence, sexual and gender violence, suicide, substance abuse, untreated mental health, right? All of these indicators of violence that come from poverty and also from colonialism, which I'll talk about here in a second, or in a minute. We experience 45% unemployment rates in states like South Dakota, New Mexico, and Arizona. It's not It's not a coincidence that there are large Lakota and Dakota land bases and large challenges to the legitimacy of the way that land and private property are run in these locations by Navajo people and Lakota and Dakota people. Native people, as was said earlier, experience incarceration higher than any other group in the United States. Native children experience post-traumatic stress disorder at the rate of veterans returning from Iraq and Afghanistan. From 1977 to 2013, the Native prison population in the so-called United States increased by 500%, along with many other populations. 13% of the homeless population in Albuquerque is Native. And in terms of healthcare, right, is the indicator of life. It's the indicator of well-being and longevity, right? So it's also an indicator of how violence impacts and impedes that. In the state of New Mexico, $2,849 is spent on Native health care per capita on each individual by the Indian Health Service. Meanwhile, the national average in the United States is $8,895 for a normal U.S. citizen, and in the state of New Mexico, it's $7,315 per inmate in New Mexico correctional institutions. And I forgot what the report is. My partner Nick is the one who does kind of all the statistical research. I do a lot of the analysis on colonialism. But it was found that the Native urban population in New Mexico, i.e. primarily the population in Albuquerque, has the worst health care of any population in the entire United States. And so that really tells you about the situation of violence and the extreme and catastrophic context of violence that Native people in Albuquerque experience. And in terms of police treatment of Native people, I only have a few minutes left. It's really characterized by intimidation, extreme brutality, and then this concept of an extrajudicial system. This is something the chair of my department kind of incorporated or talked to us about when we started to do the work on border town violence here in American Studies at UNM. And this idea of an extrajudicial system is really one in which sort of the common sense of colonialism, which is a common sense of anti-Indianism, it's a common sense that Native people must be disappeared constantly because we're attached to political entities that really fundamentally challenge the system of U.S. supremacy, of U.S. sovereignty, of U.S. domination, right? The very existence of the United States. That there's extrajudicial killing, that the police, even though they're part of the judicial system in the United States, that the police really enforce on the streets in a place like Albuquerque, and I'll describe how this happens, and I think you heard this in some of the testimony that was given right before I came up here. It's arbitrary, it's nebulous, it happens on the streets, it doesn't happen in institutions. It happens in back alleyways at night, it happens outside of the purview of the law. And the police and citizens both enforce this in Albuquerque. When we think about the killings of Cowboy and Rabbit, Allison Gorman, Keith Thompson, two Navajo men who were brutally bludgeoned to death beyond the point of recognition. You know, last July here in Albuquerque. What we're talking about, 2 minutes. What we're talking about is extrajudicial violence. And the fact that it doesn't happen within the purview of institutions, the fact that it happens all the time, creates a climate of fear and a climate of violence, where Native people in Albuquerque, much like what you just heard in that testimony, always have to be wary of violence coming from absolutely every direction, not just the cops in Albuquerque. Right? And so it's this system, the colonialism creates this system in which if the common sense of the citizenship and of the state and its institutions and its primary arbiters and enforcers like the police force, if the system is premised on the disappearance and the killability, right, and the invisibility of Native people because we threaten the legitimacy of the system, the fundamental legitimacy of the system itself, then you understand why those levels of violence are so high, why they happen everywhere all the time. They can be spontaneous, instantaneous, and it's because they're structural that they exist in such extreme forms. A Native person has to be disappeared, their presence has to be eradicated, right, in order for that legitimacy to constantly be reinforced and to constantly be reinscribed. Native people are seen as a threat, especially in a place like Albuquerque, where we're entirely surrounded by treaty lands, by indigenous nations, where 10% of our population is comprised of the largest indigenous nation in the so-called United States, right? And so this idea of containment, this common sense of containment, this common sense of extreme violence against Native people, that helps us to explain why that exists in such a profound way in a place like Albuquerque. And just to close, you know, there are also statistics and there are also reports that talk about the way that police, right, and this is part of the militarization of different sectors, so-called public sectors or service sectors in the United States. The way that police have in locations with large urban locations with large Native American populations, how the police have been increasingly expected to perform the role of service provider, whether it's to mediate domestic violence services, family violence, mental illness or mental health issues, issues of sexual and gender violence, etc. And part of this is the confluence of the state, the colonial state, using police to violate treaties, because those services are actually premised on treaties. If you ever look up the history of treaties, we have 291, because we have 291 indigenous nations represented in Albuquerque. You have 291 treaties that are constantly violated, that are never enforced, that are completely ignored, and those treaties have written in them the funds and the services that are supposed to be provided to Native populations. So why in the hell do Native people in a place like Albuquerque have the worst health care of any other population in the country? It's because of colonialism, it's because of anti-Indian common sense, and the Red Nation is trying to work on these issues. We're trying to mobilize and work with Native populations, particularly urban populations, and we're excited to be involved in this process and to collaborate with other people, and we also ask that you understand our issues and that we all work together to help poor Native people in this city stop dying, because they die every day. And we're holding a similar event to this in Gallup on April 4th. I can tell you more about it if you want, to recognize the 176 Native, primarily Navajo people who have died unnatural and brutal deaths there, much in the same way that all of these people on this wall have here in Albuquerque.